I started a small business with my closest friend, and 14 months in we were forced to choose between saving the business and saving the friendship, and what we chose, and how we chose it changed both of us in ways neither of us had anticipated or prepared for. The idea started the way most ideas between close friends start, which is to say it started informally, over food, in the specific conversational register of two people who are comfortable enough with each other that the line between serious and hypothetical is blurry enough to cross without noticing. We were at Marcus's kitchen table on a Sunday evening in March, the kind of Sunday that exists in that particular zone between the weekend ending and the working week beginning, and we had been talking for a couple of hours about nothing in particular when the conversation shifted in the way it sometimes did with us, from the casual surface towards something more purposeful, without a clear moment of transition. Marcus and I had known each other for 11 years at that point. We had met in the second year of university, in the specific way that university friendships form, through proximity and shared circumstance, and the gradual accumulation of time spent together that eventually crosses a threshold from acquaintance to something you would not choose to lose. We had stayed close through the decade after graduating, through the various cities we had each lived in, and the various jobs we had each taken, and the relationships that had come and gone, and the ordinary turbulence of being in your late 20s and early 30s, and not yet having the full picture of what your life was going to look like. He was one of the small number of people I knew who I could call with something real and trust that what I got back would be honest rather than comfortable, which is a rarer quality in adult friendship than anyone tells you it is going to be. He had been working in digital marketing for 6 years and had reached the specific point of frustration that skilled people tend to reach when they have been good at something in a structure that does not reward the goodness adequately, the point where the gap between what you are contributing and what you are receiving has been visible for long enough that accepting it starts to feel like a choice rather than a circumstance. I had been running a small freelance consultancy in brand strategy, working alone, which had its own frustrations of the opposite kind, the freedom being real and the isolation being real alongside it in equal measure. We had talked before about the general idea of doing something together without ever getting specific, the way people who work in adjacent fields and like each other talk about collaboration without meaning it as a concrete proposal. That Sunday evening in March it became a concrete proposal. Not dramatically, not with a formal pitch or a business plan or a moment of mutual decision. More like the conversation found its way to a specific enough version of the idea that it stopped being hypothetical and started being real, and we both recognized the stopping simultaneously and looked at each other across the kitchen table in the way of two people who have just crossed a line they had both been approaching without admitting it. The specific idea was a brand consultancy with a content production capability, which sounds dry as a description and was considerably more alive as Marcus described it that evening, his energy for it having the specific quality of someone who has been thinking about a thing privately for longer than they have been saying so. His digital marketing background and my brand strategy experience were genuinely complementary in the way that business partnerships between friends often claim to be and rarely actually are, and the complementarity was real enough that I had noticed it years before that Sunday without doing anything about it. He was better than me at the execution side, the production and the platform mechanics and the analytics, and I was better than him at the upstream work, the strategy and the positioning and the client-facing narrative. Together we covered a range that neither of us could cover alone. That was the genuine case for the partnership, and it was a good case and we both knew it. We spent the next month in the preliminary stage that all new businesses spend in, the stage of excitement and planning, and the specific optimism that comes before the actual work begins and before the actual problems reveal themselves. We registered the company, divided the equity equally 50-50, which felt right at the time and which I want to note was one of the decisions we would come to understand differently later, opened a business bank account, built a website, and set about the work of finding clients. Marcus told his employer he was leaving. I wound down most of my freelance commitments to create the capacity the new business would need from me. The first 4 months were the best months. We landed 2 initial clients through Marcus's network and 1 through mine. The early revenue was sufficient to be encouraging without being sufficient to be comfortable, and the work itself had the quality that work has when it is new and chosen, and being done in the company of someone you genuinely like. We had an office, a shared space in a building that rented desks by the month, and we were there most days, working, and then usually eating together at the end of the day, in the way of people who are spending most of their waking hours together, and finding that they still have things to say to each other when the working part is done. The first sign of the thing that would become the central difficulty appeared in month 5, quietly enough that I did not identify it as a sign of anything. One of our clients, the largest of the 3, had a project that required a significant amount of the production work that was Marcus's domain and a relatively modest amount of the strategy work that was mine. I was involved in the early stages, the positioning and the creative brief, and then the project moved into execution and Marcus was running it, and I was available for questions but not centrally required. I found other work to do, the business development side, new client conversations, the refinement of our offering. The month worked out fine. In month 6, another project followed a similar pattern. In month 7, 2 projects were running simultaneously, and both were execution heavy. I was doing the business development and the client management and the strategy input where it was needed, but the visible daily work, the thing that was producing the deliverables the clients were paying for, was predominantly Marcus's. I noticed this and I noted it privately, and I did not say anything about it because it seemed like a function of the specific projects we had landed rather than a structural pattern, and because saying something about it felt, at the time, like raising a complaint that was not yet clearly justified. In month 8, I raised it. Not as a complaint, not with any particular sharpness, more as an observation in one of our regular Monday check-ins, that I wanted to make sure we were thinking about the balance of the work going forward, that I was finding my contribution to the current projects less central than I had expected, and that I wanted to make sure we were pitching for projects that would use the full range of what the partnership had to offer. Marcus listened and said he agreed, and that he would make sure to involve me more in the execution phases, and that we should both be looking for clients who needed the strategic input more than pure production capability. This conversation happened, and the following 2 weeks were different. I was more involved, and then the pattern reasserted itself. Not deliberately, not through any decision Marcus made to exclude me. The clients we had were the clients we had, and their needs were their needs, and the work distributed itself according to those needs, rather than according to what I had said in the Monday check-in. I understood this, and also found it increasingly difficult to sit with, the gap between what I had expected the partnership to look like in practice, and what it actually looked like becoming wider with each month. By month 10, I had developed a private accounting of the situation that I was not sharing with Marcus, and that was becoming more elaborate with each addition to it. The accounting went roughly like this. Marcus was doing more of the billable work. The clients were his clients primarily, sourced from his network and with relationships that were more his than mine. The business was functioning, but it was functioning as Marcus's business with my involvement, rather than as the equal partnership we had agreed to. The equity split was 50-50, but the actual contribution was not 50-50, and the gap between the nominal arrangement and the practical reality was the specific kind of gap that grows larger the longer it is not addressed. I did not say any of this directly to Marcus in month 10. I said a version of it, a careful managed version, in a conversation that was too oblique to produce a real response, and Marcus said things that were reassuring without being specific, and I allowed the reassurance to substitute for the specific response I needed, and we moved on without the thing having been properly addressed. This is the mistake I want to describe carefully, because it is the central mistake of the first 14 months, and because understanding it required me to understand something about myself that I would rather not have had to understand. I was conflict-averse in a way that I had not previously had clear evidence of, because the previous contexts of my life had not required me to have a conflict with someone I cared about, while simultaneously being financially dependent on the outcome of the relationship. The consultancy work I had done alone had not required me to navigate sustained disagreement with anyone. The friendships in my life, including the friendship with Marcus, had not previously had a financial structure attached to them that made the stakes of a direct conversation concrete in the way that money makes things concrete. I had thought of myself before this as someone who was reasonably direct, someone who could have hard conversations when they were necessary. The first 14 months of the business demonstrated that this self-assessment had been tested primarily in low-stakes contexts, and that the high-stakes version of the test produced a different result. Marcus, I learned later, had his own private accounting running in parallel to mine. His accounting was different in its content, but similar in the fact of its privacy, the fact of it being something he was carrying without saying. His version went roughly like this. He was doing more of the billable work, and he knew it, and he had been waiting for me to address it directly rather than in the oblique versions I had been offering, and my not addressing it directly was producing in him a growing uncertainty about whether I was engaged with the business in the way that he needed me to be, whether the partnership was genuinely equal in commitment, even if it was not currently equal in deliverable output. He had been reading my obliqueness as disengagement rather than as conflict avoidance, and the reading had been producing its own accumulation of unspoken concern. 2 private accountings, running in parallel, neither being shared with the other person, each producing a growing distortion of the situation that was making the actual conversation harder to have the longer it was deferred. This is the mechanism of most partnership breakdowns, and it is not unique to business, and it is not complicated to understand once you are outside it. Inside it, the mechanism is invisible because the deferral of each conversation feels, in the moment of deferral, like a reasonable choice, like waiting for a better moment, or a clearer articulation, or a situation that is less fraught. The better moment does not arrive because there is no version of a difficult conversation that is not difficult, and waiting for the easier version is waiting for something that does not exist. The crisis arrived in month 14 in the form of an opportunity that forced both accountings into the open simultaneously. A large client, the largest we had been in conversation with, offered us a project that was the biggest single piece of work we had been presented with. The budget was significant. The scope was significant. The problem was that the scope was almost entirely production-heavy. the kind of work that Marcus could execute with a small additional resource brought in to help, and that required my strategic input only in the first 2 weeks of a 4-month engagement. We had a meeting about whether to take it. The meeting started as a practical conversation about capacity and resourcing, and became, within about 20 minutes, the conversation we had both been not having for 4 months. Not through any dramatic escalation, not through a fight of the sudden sharp kind. More through the specific quality of a conversation that has been waiting to happen, finding its opportunity in the occasion of a decision that required clarity neither of us had been willing to provide. Marcus said, directly and without the careful management that our previous conversations about this had involved, that he thought we needed to talk about what the business actually was and what each of us was actually contributing to it, because the current situation was not what he had thought he was signing up for, and he needed to know whether I saw it the same way or differently. I said I saw it the same way. He said which way. I said that the balance of the work had not been what either of us had expected, and that I had been finding it difficult to raise directly, and that I was sorry I had not raised it more clearly earlier, because the clarity would have been more useful than the versions I had offered. He said he was sorry too for not pushing harder on it when he had sensed it was there. That exchange, those 30 seconds of mutual directness after 4 months of mutual avoidance, changed the quality of the conversation immediately in the specific way that things change when the surface version is replaced by the real version. Not resolved, not fixed, but different in its quality. The difference between two people discussing a problem they are both acknowledging and two people discussing a problem while also performing that it does not exist. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. The large client project sat on the table between us as the occasion for the conversation, but stopped being the subject of it fairly quickly, the project becoming the frame that the actual conversation was happening inside rather than the thing the conversation was about. What the conversation was about was the structure of the business, and the structure of the partnership and the gap between the two, and what we were each going to need from the other, in order for the business to be something that both of us could genuinely commit to rather than something one of us was running, and the other was associated with. Marcus said that what he needed from me was not more hours of visible work, or a more even distribution of deliverables. He said he understood that the nature of strategic work was that it happened in phases, and that the execution phases would always be more his domain than mine. What he needed was for me to be the person who owned the front end of the business, the client relationships and the new business development, and the strategic framing of what we were, and what we offered, in a way that was as active and committed as his ownership of the execution was. He said he had been feeling like he was running the business from his side, while waiting for me to run it from mine, and that the waiting had been producing a loneliness in the working experience that he had not expected to feel when we were doing this together. That word loneliness landed specifically. I sat with it for a moment. He was not describing a financial grievance or a workload complaint. He was describing a quality of the daily experience of the business that had to do with feeling alone in something he had expected to feel accompanied in. And the description was accurate in a way that financial language would not have been, accurate to the actual problem, which was not about hours or deliverables, but about the texture of the partnership, whether I was genuinely in it alongside him, or adjacent to it in a way that felt like presence while functioning more like absence. I told him what I had been carrying. The private accounting, the growing feeling that the business was becoming his with my participation rather than ours with equal participation, the difficulty I had been having with raising it, because the raising of it required me to acknowledge that I was not contributing equally, and the acknowledging of that felt like a concession I was not ready to make without understanding the cause. I said the cause, as far as I had been able to determine it, was that I had not been as active in the business development as I had needed to be, that I had been allowing the immediate work to fill the time that should have been going to finding the next work, and that the immediate work was predominantly his, and therefore the time had been predominantly his, and the imbalance had been my failure as much as a structural problem. He said that was honest. I said it was late to be honest, but it was what was true. He said late was better than not at all. We talked about the large project, and about what taking it or not taking it meant for the business. The project was genuinely significant in financial terms. The revenue from it would give the business a stability it had not yet had, and would provide a runway that would allow us to be more selective about subsequent work. But taking it would mean 4 months of the imbalance continuing, 4 months of Marcus doing the primary work while I was in the supporting role, 4 months of a pattern that we had just agreed was the pattern we needed to change. Not taking it meant foregoing a significant financial opportunity at a moment when the business needed opportunities. Marcus said he thought we should take it, and that we should use the 4 months to do the work of fixing the structure in parallel, not after the project was done but during it. He said the project would keep the business financially healthy, while we fixed the thing that was threatening to make the business something that did not work for both of us. He said the fixing had to be real, and not another version of the conversations we had been having for the previous 4 months. He said he needed to see the active version of what I had described, the front-end work happening, the new client conversations, the business development that would mean the next 4 months were not followed by another 4 months of the same imbalance. I said yes. I said I understood what he was describing, and that I agreed, and that the honest conversation we had just had was the conversation I had been making harder to have than it needed to be, and that I was going to stop doing that. He said he had not been blameless in the avoidance either, and that he had his own version of the thing to work on. I asked what his version was. He said his version was the tendency he had to absorb problems rather than articulate them, to take on more than was his to take on rather than to say clearly what he needed, which was a pattern he recognized from other parts of his life, and that had been operating here without him deciding to let it operate. He said he had been absorbing my absence rather than namming it, and that the namming was his responsibility, as much as the showing up was mine. We took the project. The 4 months that followed were the hardest working period of the business, and also, paradoxically, the period in which the partnership functioned, most like the thing we had originally imagined it would be. Not because the imbalance was resolved immediately, it was not. The project was still execution heavy, and Marcus was still doing the majority of the deliverable work. But the conversation had changed something in the quality of the working relationship that was present in the daily texture of things, in a way that was different from the daily texture of the previous 4 months. The difference was that we were talking, not the managed versions of talking that the previous months had contained, the careful conversations that stayed away from the real subject. The actual version, the one where the real subject was available, and both of us were willing to go there when it needed to be gone to. That availability changed everything about the experience of the work, even when the work itself did not change. I had not understood, before the 3-hour conversation, how much of what I had found difficult about the previous months had been the isolation of carrying the private accounting rather than the accounting's content. The content was real and needed addressing, but the isolation was the thing that had made it heaviest, and the isolation had ended the moment we had the direct conversation. I did the business development work during the 4 months. Not perfectly, not with the full competence of someone who had been doing it well for years, but with the genuine effort of someone who understood what was required and was applying themselves to it without the ambiguity that had been undermining the application for the preceding months. I had 3 significant new client conversations during the project, and 2 of them converted into work that was scheduled to begin when the large project ended. The work that converted was more strategically oriented than what we had been doing, which was partly a function of how I had been positioning us in the conversations, and partly a function of the kind of clients I had been targeting, clients whose primary need was the upstream work rather than the production capability. Marcus noticed the change and said so, in the specific way of someone who is registering a thing without making too much of it, which is the right way to register a change that is still in its early stages, and does not need the weight of being made into a narrative before it has had time to establish itself. He mentioned it in one of our weekly check-ins, briefly, something about the pipeline looking more balanced than it had been, and that he thought the positioning I had been using in the new conversations was working well. I said I thought so too, and that I wanted to keep working on it. He said good. That was the extent of it, and the extent of it was exactly right. The large project ended in the 2nd week of December, 4 months after we had taken it. The financial position of the business was significantly better than it had been, the runway was real, and the 2 pieces of work I had brought in during the project were set to begin in January. Marcus and I had a dinner to mark the end of the project's first significant chapter, not a celebration exactly, more an acknowledgement, the specific kind of dinner that marks a period of difficulty that has been navigated rather than a triumph that has been achieved. Over dinner he said something that I have thought about since in the context of what the year had taught me about friendship, and about working with people you care about. He said he thought the worst moment of the 14 months had not been the 3-hour conversation, but the months leading up to it, the months of the private accountings and the managed conversations, and the growing sense that the friendship was being changed by the business in ways that he had not had the language to address. He said the worst of it had been the specific quality of being in the office with someone he had known for 11 years, and feeling like the business was creating a version of both of them that was less honest and less present than the version that existed outside of it. I said I had felt the same thing. I said I had been afraid in the months before the conversation that the business would damage the friendship permanently, and that the fear of the damage had been one of the things making me avoid the conversation that was the only thing that could actually prevent the damage. He said yes, and that was the specific trap, the thing you are afraid of being caused by the action that is the only way to prevent it. The conversation felt like a risk to the friendship. The not having the conversation was the actual risk to the friendship. From outside the situation, the priority was obvious. From inside it, the fear had been louder than the logic. In January, the new work began, and the business entered a different phase, more balanced in its structure, the strategic work and the production work distributing themselves more evenly across both of us in the way we had originally imagined. Not perfectly balanced, nothing in practice is perfectly balanced, but with a quality of mutual engagement that the previous phase had lacked, both of us doing work that was genuinely ours rather than one of us doing the work while the other figured out his role in it. The clients who came in through my business development work during the project months were different from the earlier clients, not better as clients necessarily, but better suited to the full range of what the partnership offered. They wanted the strategic thinking, and they wanted the production capability as its execution. And the shape of the work allowed Marcus and me to function in the way we had described to each other at Marcus's kitchen table on the Sunday evening in March when the whole thing had started. He executing what I had positioned, me positioning what he would execute, the complementarity that had been the original case for the partnership finally operating as the partnership's actual structure rather than as its theoretical one. The second year was better than the first in almost every way that mattered. The revenue was higher, the work was more interesting, the client relationships were stronger, but the thing I found most significant about the second year was something that was harder to measure than revenue, which was the quality of the working relationship itself. The specific texture of being in a partnership with someone where the communication was honest enough that problems were identified and addressed rather than accumulated and managed. We had difficult conversations in the second year too. Two of them were significant, one about a client situation where Marcus and I had genuinely different views about how to handle a problem, and needed to work through the difference rather than one of us deferring to the other, and one about the equity structure, which we eventually agreed to adjust to reflect a more accurate picture of the different kinds of contribution we were each making. An adjustment that required both of us to be honest about what we were bringing and honest about what the other was bringing, and to resist the pull toward the comfortable fiction that equal equity meant identical contribution. Both conversations were hard, both conversations were had. Neither of them became the thing that accumulated for 4 months before being addressed in a 3-hour crisis conversation. The equity conversation is worth describing in some detail, because it was the one that required the most from both of us, and because the outcome of it was not what either of us had initially wanted. When I raised it in the spring of the second year, my expectation was that the adjustment would go in my direction, that the contribution I had been making to the business development and the client relationships and the strategic positioning was being undervalued relative to Marcus's production work, and that a rebalancing of the equity would reflect the true relative contributions more accurately. Marcus's expectation, which he had been carrying without saying, was that the adjustment would go in his direction, that the execution work was the work that was directly generating the revenue, and that a rebalancing would reflect the primacy of that. We were both right about what we were each contributing. We were both wrong about the direction the adjustment should go. What the conversation produced, after 2 sessions over 2 weeks, was a shared understanding that the business could not function without both contributions, and that the question of which contribution was more valuable was not answerable in the way we had each been privately answering it, because the 2 contributions were not comparable on a single scale, but were differently essential. The revision we made to the equity structure was modest in its numbers, a small adjustment that acknowledged the difference in hours being contributed during the execution phases, but the process of arriving at it was not modest in its significance. It required both of us to give up the private accounting that had been saying our contribution was undervalued, and to replace it with an honest assessment of what we were each actually providing. The business is now in its 3rd year. It is profitable and growing at a pace that is sustainable rather than spectacular, which is the pace I would choose if the choice were mine to make, which it partly is. The client base is diverse and the work is consistently interesting, which are the things I value most in the work and which the current structure of the business is producing. Marcus and I are in the office most days and usually eat together at the end of the working day, which is the same pattern we had in the 1st year and which has a different quality in the 3rd year, the quality of something that has been tested and has held rather than the quality of something new and untested. The friendship is different from what it was before the business, not damaged, the damage that I had feared, and that the management of the first 14 months had been partly aimed at preventing, did not happen, but changed in the specific way that things change when they are put under a real load and found to be more durable than they appeared. The friendship before the business had been an 11-year friendship that had never been tested by sustained high-stakes conflict, and the not having been tested had been part of its quality, its ease. The friendship now has been tested and has not broken, and the having been tested and not broken is a different kind of ease, a quality of solidity rather than smoothness, the specific confidence of knowing what the thing is made of because you have seen what it takes to strain it. Marcus said something once, in the autumn of the 2nd year, that I want to try to reproduce accurately because it captures something about the whole experience that I have not found a better way of saying. We were walking back from a client dinner, and it was one of those autumn evenings that has the specific quality of the city in autumn, cool and lit, and he said that he thought the business had made him a worse friend in the 1st year and a better friend in the 2nd, and that the difference between those 2 versions had been a single conversation and everything that had flowed from having it. I said I thought that was right. He said the lesson he was taking from it was not about business, and not really about friendship, but about the cost of avoidance, the specific tax that avoiding a difficult thing puts on everything around the thing you are avoiding, and about how the tax is always higher than the cost of the conversation that would have made it unnecessary. I have thought about the tax of avoidance since he said that, in the various contexts in my life where the avoidance of a difficult thing is available as an option. It is always available as an option. The option is always more immediately comfortable than the alternative, And the tax is always there, running quietly in the background, accumulating interest. The first 14 months of the business was the most complete demonstration I have had of how the tax works and what it costs, and how the ledger eventually requires settlement regardless of how long you defer it. The settlement, when it came, was not cheap. But it was far less expensive than continuing to defer it would have been, and far less expensive than what deferring it indefinitely would have cost, which was the business and the friendship both, the specific version of losing everything by trying too hard to avoid losing anything. We are still in the shared office space, the same building we started in, though we have expanded to a slightly larger desk allocation. The website is the same one we built in the first month, though the content on it has been updated several times. The company bank account is the same one we opened on a Tuesday morning in April of the first year. Marcus and me sitting across from a young bank employee who asked us several standard questions about the business and who had no idea, nor should he have, that the two people answering his questions would spend the next year and 2 months in the specific productive difficulty of figuring out how to be in a business together, without letting the being in a business change what they were to each other. It changed it anyway, not in the direction we had feared, not in the direction of damage and loss, in the direction of depth, the specific depth of a relationship that has been through something real and has come out the other side knowing itself better than it did before. That is not nothing. That is, in the accounting that I now keep rather than the private one I was keeping in months 8 through 13, one of the more significant things the business has produced. More significant, I think, than the revenue or the clients or the growing reputation in the market. Those things are real and I am glad of them. But the friendship, tested and holding and different in its quality for having been tested, is the thing I would not trade and the thing I was most afraid of losing, and the thing that the only way to save turned out to be the very thing I had been most afraid to do.